Welcome to episode 10, double digits, episode 10 of K&A Bible. Today, Austin and I are talking about chapter 18, 19, and 20. 3 chapters. There's a lot to talk about, but we're going to condense it down, so we're not going to take 45 minutes. So this is K&A Bible. So at the beginning of chapter 18, Paul left Athens, back from chapter 17, and he went to Corinth. And there he met a couple, and they started tent making together. So building tents is what I'm assuming that means.
I would assume so, yeah.
Maybe they were campers, I don't know. And so they started tent making, and they became friends. And so they were friends. And then every Sabbath, Paul would go to the synagogues and preach, because that's what you do on the Sabbath. And Paul was him, and that's what he did. So he was preaching in the synagogues, and a lot of the Jews in the synagogues rejected his message. I mean, imagine rejecting Paul's message. I mean, you got to be a loser to do that. But so they rejected his message, and so he turned his attention and started preaching and teaching towards the Gentiles. And a lot of other people in the area, Gentiles and stuff, ended up believing and repenting and got baptized. So Paul was there doing the preaching for a while, and then God appeared to him in a vision and was like, hey, you got to stay here in Corinth for a while and keep preaching and keep teaching in the synagogues. And Paul was like, okay, I will. So he did, and he ended up staying there in Corinth for 1 year and 6 months. So 1.5 years he was there. And the Jews were upset by this, and so they went to this big high up dude named Galio. And they said to Galio, they're like, hey, we don't like what Paul's doing. We don't like what he's saying and preaching. Can you please throw this guy in jail? Because that's what everyone resorts to in Acts, is by throwing people in jail. And so this Galio guy was just like, yes, but I don't care about your religious disputes. So no, I don't care what he does. And Paul was like, aha, good. And continued on preaching and sharing and doing what he was doing for the next 1.5 years of his life.
So after Paul spent that 1.5 years in Corinth, he eventually left. So he went to Ephesus, he cut his hair, and the Bible felt that was very important to mention. So he cuts his hair, goes to Ephesus, and he preaches there for a little bit in the synagogues. And when he's getting ready to leave, they're like, hey, can you please stay? We really like what you're teaching, unlike those Jews back there. We like what you're saying. He's like, no, I can't stay. I got to continue on my way. So as he goes, then Apollos, as he's getting ready to leave, Apollos, which we've all heard of, he's this Jew. He's very well spoken. He knows a lot about the scriptures, and he starts falsely preaching, and the Jews begin to worship him. Some of the Christians begin to worship him instead of God. They think that he's kind of like a second Jesus sort of figure. So then Paul goes and he's talking to some of those Christians there. He's like, hey, like, this isn't the right thing to do. We shouldn't listen to this guy. And that's kind of the end of 18 there.
And then in chapter 19, Paul is in Ephesus, and he runs into like these 12 disciples who somehow know all about John the Baptist, but they don't know about Jesus, which I don't really know how that works, but it worked. And so Paul talks to these guys and shares the gospel with them, and they all get saved and they all get baptized. So Paul stays there in Ephesus teaching for 3 months, but then the Jews in the synagogues get really again, they weren't listening, and he was like, okay, I'm going to move. So then he moves to another location where he ends up preaching there for another 2 years. And then in the time frame, God ends up performing a lot of miracles through Paul. He's casting out demons in the name of God. He's performing many miracles. And then there are some magicians. Magicians who are around and see that he's seeing that he's getting rid of these demons in the name of Jesus. And then a bunch of exorcists around the area start seeing this, and they're like, oh, I'm going to use the name of Jesus to get rid of these demons for myself. And for a while it works. They're going up, they're going over the demon possessed people, and they're saying, in the name of Jesus, I command you, demon, to get out. And it works for a little bit, except for one instance. There's a group of exorcists, I guess. They go over, and there's a demon possessed man, and they say, in the name of Jesus, who Paul worships, I command you to leave this spirit. and the demon is like, no. And so the demon possessed man leaps on him, like jumps on him, starts beating him up, and sends the exorcists running out of the house, wounded and naked.
I think we need a demonstration. I think we need a
No,
quick demonstration.
we do not. Anything else to say, Austin?
No.
Okay. So then word spread about these magicians and everything that went wrong with the exorcism. And so all these magicians and other Christians who practice magic all got together and ended up burning all of their books, which ended up equivalenting 50,000 pieces of silver, which I think Austin did the math on how much that is now.
Yeah, that's about $1.5 million in books that they went ahead and burned.
So a lot of books. That's kind of like the equivalent of like our church library.
We assume. We don't know. So after the riot in chapter 19, Paul leaves and he's looking for another place to go, and he finds a place in Macedonia. So he's there teaching in Macedonia, and he gathers together a bunch of believers, and he's teaching in an upper room. Now, I know that sometimes, this isn't a knock on anyone who teaches at the church or anyone who preaches, but sometimes it can get a little bit boring, okay? And sometimes, maybe you were out late the night before, something like that, right? Maybe you start to doze off.
There's late college football games on Saturday nights.
Right, exactly. So you doze off a little bit, but, there isn't really that much damage done, right? You fall asleep, and then your friends take a quick picture of you down the pew, and you're just like, oh, dang it, now there's a picture of me circulating
We're
around.
not looking at Debbie
Not looking at Debbie. But that's all the damage is done, right? Then you wake up, you go to Poncho's afterwards. It's a good day. It's overall a good day. Unfortunately, Paul's preaching was a little bit boring for one of these young believers. He fell asleep while sitting in a window, and because of his sleep, his friends didn't take any pictures, didn't make fun of him, and so he fell out of the window and died. But Paul said not that. So Paul goes downstairs and he's like, hey, what if you didn't die? And so he raises him from the dead, which is pretty cool. And so, it's a lesson to all you guys. Don't fall asleep in church. You could die. And there's no Paul here to save you.
The ceiling things could fall down.
Yeah, they could. And there's no Paul this time. So stay diligent.
And then Paul is going to go back to Jerusalem. And so he calls all of the elders and says, hey, I'm going to go back to Jerusalem. Remember what I've done here. It's for the past however many months or years. He encourages the elders, saying to guide the disciples that God had entrusted with them. He said to help the weak and keep teaching and just be those good elders, be the leaders. He pretty much just encourages them as he's getting ready to go. And so he goes back to Jerusalem, and that's kind of the end of chapter 20. So thank you for listening to episode 10 of K&A Bible. Next week, there's a lot of chapters. So stay tuned for next week. It should be fun. This was K&A Bible. Thanks for listening.